It was a bright afternoon, the kind of day where the streets were filled with people rushing from one place to another. The sun was shining, small shops were open, and children could be heard laughing at a distance. Among the crowd, a young man walked with steady steps. He carried a simple black backpack on his shoulders, the kind many people use for work, books, or just daily needs. He wasn't in a hurry, but his walk was confident, like someone who knew where he was going. At the same time, a police officer was driving slowly along the same street, scanning the sidewalks as he usually did. He believed he was keeping the area safe, but behind that thought sat an attitude he himself wasn't fully aware of. His eyes, instead of noticing everyone equally, often focused on certain people more than others, and on that day, his attention locked onto the young man with the backpack. The man wasn't doing anything wrong. He wasn't shouting, wasn't bothering anyone, and wasn't even walking fast. Still, the officer's mind began to form a story of its own. The backpack suddenly looked suspicious in his eyes. He wondered if maybe it carried stolen goods or something dangerous. No evidence, no reason, just a thought fueled by bias. The officer parked his car to the side and stepped out. He called out to the young man, asking him to stop. The man turned around, surprised. He wasn't expecting to be stopped by the police, but he did not resist. He adjusted the strap of his bag, took a step closer, and politely asked if something was wrong. The officer, keeping a stern face, demanded to know what was inside the bag. The young man replied in a calm tone, saying it was just his work things, some papers, a small lunchbox, and personal items. But the officer wasn't satisfied. His suspicion was already built in, and every word the man said felt like an excuse to him. People on the street began slowing down, curious about the situation. At first they thought it might be a normal check, something routine, but soon they noticed the tension. The officer's voice was louder, more pressing, while the man kept repeating the same thing, that he had done nothing wrong, that he was simply walking home after finishing his shift. Still, the officer didn't listen. He asked the man to put his hands behind his back. The man froze, confused. He asked why he was being treated like this when he hadn't done anything. But before he could say much more, the officer took hold of his arms firmly. The cold steel of handcuffs clicked around his wrists, shocking not only him but also the people who were now gathering closer to watch. Whispers spread quickly through the crowd. Some shook their heads, others pulled out their phones to record. A woman nearby could be heard saying, "Why is he being arrested?" "He didn't do anything!" A man muttered. "This doesn't look right at all." The air shifted from casual curiosity to unease. The young man stood there, hands bound, his face filled with a mix of frustration and sadness. He wasn't shouting or resisting. Instead, he spoke firmly but respectfully, telling the officer that this was a mistake, that he had the wrong person. His words carried the weight of someone who had faced unfairness before, someone who knew what it felt like to be judged for no reason. But the officer had already made up his mind. He started guiding the man toward his car, ignoring the questions and complaints from bystanders. In his head, he thought he was acting on instinct, doing his duty. He thought he was stopping a possible crime before it could happen. Yet the reality was very different. He wasn't protecting anyone in that moment. He was unfairly targeting someone innocent. The young man glanced around at the faces in the crowd. Some looked sympathetic, some angry, and some just shocked. For him, the hardest part wasn't the handcuffs. It was the feeling of being treated like a criminal in front of strangers, when all he had done was walk home peacefully. He thought of his family, of how they would feel if they saw him like this, embarrassed and powerless on the side of the road. The officer asked him again about the bag. The man repeated the same simple truth. "It's just my work things." But the officer wasn't really listening. He opened the bag roughly, taking out the items one by one. A half-eaten sandwich, some folded papers, a small water bottle. Ordinary things, the kind anyone could carry. The crowd murmured louder, realizing how absurd the situation was. Yet even then, the officer didn't let go. His pride wouldn't allow him to admit he might have been wrong. He told the man he was being detained for questioning, using official words that made the action seem justified. But to the people watching, it looked like nothing more than unfair treatment. The young man lowered his head, trying to stay calm. Inside, anger and sadness wrestled with each other. He knew that losing control or raising his voice would only make things worse, so he held himself steady, breathing deeply, hoping the truth would eventually come out. Minutes passed, but to him, they felt like hours. Every second in those handcuffs felt heavy, like a punishment he hadn't earned. He thought of the many times he had worked hard, followed rules, and done everything right, only to find that in some eyes it still wasn't enough. That day was just another painful reminder. Meanwhile, the officer radioed in, calling for backup. He wanted more eyes on the situation, perhaps to strengthen his decision. But deep down, even he started to feel a small sting of doubt. He looked again at the man, at the simple items from his bag, at the crowd's disapproving faces. Still, he didn't step back. The street, once filled with normal city sounds, now buzzed with tension. Cars slowed down, drivers peeked out of their windows, and shopkeepers stood by their doors watching. It had become a scene everyone was talking about. One moment of bias had turned an ordinary walk into a public spectacle. The young man spoke again, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. He told the officer he worked nearby that his boss could confirm where he had been just minutes ago, that there was no reason to suspect him. Some people in the crowd nodded, supporting his words. One even said, "Let him go, he's telling the truth." But the officer stayed silent, holding onto the man's arm with a grip that felt more stubborn than strong. He didn't realize that every second he kept this going, he was not only hurting an innocent person but also losing the trust of everyone watching. And yet, the young man did not break. Though humiliated, he stood tall, his dignity untouched. He knew the truth was on his side, even if it wasn't being seen at that very moment. What he didn't know was that within a short span of time, everything was about to change, and the officer would soon regret every choice he had made that afternoon. The scene on the street was no longer just between one man and one officer. What had started as a single stop had now turned into a public moment that everyone around was paying attention to. People had paused on sidewalks, some had stopped their bicycles, and others were leaning slightly out of shop doors to see what was happening. At first, most thought it was just a normal police check. Everyone has seen such things before, and usually they end in a few minutes. But this time it didn't look that way. The young man stood with his hands in cuffs, trying to explain calmly that he had done nothing wrong, while the officer seemed determined to prove otherwise. A woman in the crowd couldn't hold back anymore. She raised her voice, asking the officer why he was arresting the man. She said she had been standing nearby watching him walk, and there was nothing suspicious about him. Her voice carried down the street, and a few more people agreed loudly. "Yeah, we saw him too. He wasn't doing anything," another man shouted. The officer didn't reply. He kept his eyes on the young man, as if shutting out the noise around him would make it disappear. But the noise only grew louder. People began recording with their phones, some stepping closer to get a clear view. The clicking of cameras and the faint beeps of phones starting video filled the air. The young man, still handcuffed, looked around at the faces pointed in his direction. Some were strangers, but in that moment they felt like allies. Their voices gave him strength. He raised his head and spoke louder, telling everyone that he had just left work, that he had nothing in his bag except personal things. His tone was not angry but steady, almost as if he wanted the crowd to hear his truth clearly, even if the officer refused to. One teenager near the front of the crowd whispered to his friend, "He's innocent. You can just tell by the way he's talking." His friend nodded, eyes fixed on the officer, disbelief written across his face. The officer, however, stayed firm. He spoke into his radio, asking for details and support. The radio crackled back with a faint reply, but whatever came through didn't seem to give him the solid ground he was hoping for. Still, he didn't step back. Pride was at play now. The woman who had first spoken up crossed her arms and said more firmly, "This isn't right. You're embarrassing him in front of everyone. Why can't you just listen?" A few people clapped lightly, not in celebration but in agreement. The young man felt a strange mix of emotions inside. On one side, he was frustrated that no matter how clear his words were, they weren't enough for the officer. On the other side, he felt a small spark of comfort seeing ordinary people stand up for him. People who didn't even know his name but could still see the injustice. A man in a suit, likely on his way from work, stepped closer and said to the officer, "I think you've made a mistake. I've been walking behind him for 2 blocks. He hasn't done anything suspicious." His voice was calm but carried weight. He sounded like someone who was used to being listened to. Still, the officer only tightened his jaw, pretending not to hear. The young man noticed this too and sighed. He realized that the officer wasn't really hearing anyone, not him, not the crowd. He was stuck inside his own mind, trying to hold on to control. The videos being recorded would later spread far beyond that street, but in that moment, they were simply evidence of truth. A girl holding her phone whispered to herself, "I'll upload this later. People need to see." The young man turned his eyes toward her and others recording, and though he didn't say anything, his eyes spoke gratitude. It was as if he was silently thanking them for not letting this moment be hidden or forgotten. Meanwhile, cars slowed down as drivers stretched their necks to see the scene. The honking of traffic began as some vehicles were blocked, but even the frustration of drivers soon turned into curiosity as they noticed the handcuffed man and the growing crowd around him. The young man repeated again, this time louder so everyone could hear, "I am not a criminal. I am just coming from work. My bag only has my lunchbox and some papers. You can check if you want." His voice cracked slightly at the end, not from fear but from the heavy feeling of being misunderstood. The crowd responded with louder murmurs. Someone clapped once and another shouted, "Let him go!" The energy shifted. It was no longer quiet resistance. It was turning into a public demand. The officer glanced at the crowd now, for the first time really seeing how many eyes were on him. He noticed the phones, the shaking heads, the crossed arms. For a brief second, his confidence wavered, but instead of softening, he gripped the young man's arm a little tighter, as though holding on to authority was the only thing keeping him from losing face. The young man felt that grip and closed his eyes for a second, breathing deeply. He reminded himself not to raise his voice, not to let his anger win. He had been in tough moments before, but this was different. It wasn't happening in private. It was happening on a street where everyone could see. A little boy holding his mother's hand asked innocently, "Mom, why is that man in handcuffs? Did he do something bad?" The mother looked down at her child and then back at the young man. She answered softly but firmly, "No, he didn't. Sometimes people are treated unfairly." Her words reached the ears of others standing nearby, and the weight of truth in such a simple explanation made the moment even heavier. The young man lifted his eyes again and, with quiet strength, said, "This is not just about me. This happens to people for no reason, and it shouldn't. I've done nothing wrong, and still I'm standing here like this." His words touched the crowd deeply. For many, it wasn't just his fight anymore. It became a symbol of something larger. The officer shifted uncomfortably, but still didn't release him. He spoke into his radio again, asking if there were updates. The crackle of static returned, and he listened closely. Still nothing that gave him real proof. The crowd grew restless. Some people shouted more boldly now, "We're watching. This is unfair. You need to stop this." The voices came from all directions, making it impossible for the officer to ignore. And yet the young man stood there quietly, his back straight, his voice calm when he spoke. "I will not fight you. I will not run. But you will see that I am telling the truth." It was a sentence that silenced the crowd for a moment. People looked at him with respect. Despite being humiliated, despite being treated unfairly, he refused to lose his dignity. In that silence, the only sounds were the faint wind and the beeping of a crossing light. It was a pause before things would shift again. A pause in which the officer, the man, and the crowd all stood together in a strange, tense balance. What none of them knew at that moment was that the truth was already making its way toward them. And soon, within minutes, everything would begin to turn. The street was still buzzing with voices. Phones were still raised high, and the officer still had the young man by the arm. But while the scene unfolded under the open sky, something else was happening quietly in the background. The police radio in the officer's hand was alive with static and occasional messages. Other officers had already started checking the nearby area, looking for answers. A call had gone out about a possible theft earlier that afternoon. It wasn't anything big, but it was enough for the officer to convince himself that the man with the backpack fit the description, yet the truth was already waiting to be uncovered. Inside a small shop just a few blocks away, the store manager had pulled up the security footage. The call from the police had asked him to check the cameras for the suspect. He rewound the tape carefully, eyes locked on the grainy screen. What he saw was clear. The person who had been involved in the theft looked nothing like the man now standing in handcuffs on the street. The suspect on the tape was dressed differently, walked differently, and even carried himself in a completely different way. The manager quickly reported this over the phone. Another officer relayed it to the one holding the young man. The words came through the radio, sharp and undeniable. The description doesn't match. He's not the one. But in the noise of the crowd, the officer pretended not to hear at first. His pride fought hard against the truth. Still, he couldn't ignore it for long. Another voice came through the radio, firmer this time. "We've got footage. Wrong guy. Release him." The young man looked at the officer's face. He couldn't hear what was being said on the radio, but he noticed the small flicker of doubt, the tiny crack in the officer's confident expression. It was the first sign that things might finally turn. The crowd sensed it too. A few people started whispering, "Look, something's happening. He's realizing it." The murmurs spread like a wave through the group. Meanwhile, another officer from the same department had gone to check the area where the real suspect had been spotted. On the corner of another street, a security guard pointed them in the right direction. The suspect had been caught on a different camera, and this time the footage was even clearer. The man they were really looking for was wearing a dark hoodie, not a plain shirt. He carried no backpack at all. He even had a tattoo across his arm, something the young man in handcuffs clearly didn't have. The information came back quickly. The radio once again buzzed, and this time there was no space for doubt. "Release him. He has nothing to do with this." The real suspect is already being tracked. The officer holding the cuffs froze. The words echoed louder in his head than the shouts from the crowd. He had made a mistake. A big one. The young man stood still, his eyes searching the officer's face, waiting for an answer. The crowd pressed forward slightly, phones still raised, ready to capture every second of what came next. The officer's hand twitched as he held the cuffs, but he didn't move right away. It was in that moment that reality sank in. The young man's bag was nothing but a simple backpack filled with harmless items. The stories the officer had created in his own head crumbled one by one. The weight of his decision hit him harder than the noise around him. A man from the crowd shouted, "Check the cameras, officer. You'll see he's innocent." Another voice joined in, "You got the wrong person. Admit it now." The voices were no longer just questions, they were demands. The officer opened the bag again as if hoping he had missed something. But the same items lay there, the sandwich wrapper, the folded papers, the water bottle. Ordinary things that carried no crime. Each object now seemed to shout louder than the crowd. "He is innocent." The young man finally spoke again, his tone calm but heavy with truth. "I told you I was coming from work. I told you there was nothing wrong, and now you see." His words weren't bitter, but they cut deep. The officer avoided his eyes. He turned slightly, his shoulders stiff. Pride and shame battled inside him. He wanted to hold on to authority, but authority built on a mistake was nothing but weakness. The radio crackled one last time, this time with clear instruction. "Release him now." The officer's hand moved to the cuffs, unlocking them slowly. The click of the metal opening was softer than before, but to the young man it felt like a thunderclap. The pressure around his wrists faded, but the sting of humiliation still lingered. The crowd reacted instantly. Cheers, claps, and relieved sighs filled the air. Some shouted, "We told you." Others simply nodded in approval at the young man, offering silent support. The young man rubbed his wrists lightly, then picked up his backpack. He stood tall, not with anger, but with quiet dignity. He didn't rush to leave. Instead, he looked around at the people who had stood by him. His eyes carried gratitude for their voices, for their presence, for their refusal to let him be treated unfairly without question. The officer stood awkwardly by his car, his face flushed. He avoided the cameras now, but it was too late. The recordings had captured everything, the cuffs, the protests, the release. His regret had begun the moment the truth hit his ears. But regret was not enough to erase the damage already done. The young man turned back to him and said softly, "Next time, listen before you act." It wasn't shouted. It wasn't cruel. It was simple advice, but it felt heavier than anything else said that day. The officer said nothing. His pride stopped him from apologizing in that moment, but deep down his chest felt heavy. He knew that 30 minutes ago he had made a choice that would follow him far longer than this crowd would. The people began to disperse slowly, talking among themselves about what they had seen. Some shook their heads, still angry at the unfairness. Others looked relieved that the truth had come out. but the taste of injustice lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. The young man finally walked away, his steps steady. Though free, the memory of being handcuffed without cause would stay with him. Yet so would the memory of strangers raising their voices for him, proving that sometimes, even in the worst moments, humanity can stand tall. Behind him, the officer leaned against his car, silent. He thought about how quickly his assumptions had led him down the wrong path. He thought about the radios, the cameras, the crowd, and most of all, the man who had carried himself with calm strength in the face of humiliation. The day wasn't over, but for the officer, it already felt like one of the longest days of his life. And for the young man, though the cuffs were gone, the weight of those 30 minutes still pressed on his shoulders. What neither of them knew yet was that this single mistake was about to echo far beyond that street. The recordings were already being shared. Conversations were already starting. And the officer's regret, though fresh, was only the beginning of a much deeper realization. The sound of the cuffs opening still echoed in the young man's ears, even after his wrists were free. He stood there for a moment, rubbing the faint red marks left behind. Around him, the crowd had not quieted down. If anything, the energy grew stronger, as people reacted to what they had just witnessed. Some clapped and cheered, happy that justice, at least in that small moment, had been served. Others shook their heads, frustrated at how quickly someone could be treated unfairly. A few people walked up to the young man, offering small words of encouragement. "Stay strong. We saw everything. Don't let this bring you down." The young man nodded gently, acknowledging their kindness. He wasn't the type to make a scene. Even after what had happened, he chose to carry himself with calmness. He picked up his bag slowly, as if to prove again that it contained nothing harmful. Then he slung it over his shoulder and looked at the officer. The officer avoided his gaze. He shifted his weight from one foot to another, his hands moving restlessly at his sides. For the first time that day, the authority in his posture was gone. Instead, he stood heavy with the realization that he had been wrong, completely wrong. The young man's voice came quietly, but it carried far in the silence that had fallen between them. "I told you the truth." Just 5 words, but they cut deep. The officer swallowed hard. He wanted to respond, to explain himself, maybe even to apologize, but the words stuck in his throat. His pride held him back while his regret weighed him down. He could feel dozens of eyes still on him, waiting to see what he would do next. The crowd, however, didn't wait. A man shouted, "You should say sorry to him." Another voice chimed in. "He deserves respect, not cuffs." The calls grew louder, blending into a chorus that pressed against the officer's silence. The young man didn't add to the noise. Instead, he turned to the crowd and gave a small nod, almost like he was thanking them without saying it out loud. He didn't want things to get out of control. The last thing he needed was for anger to explode into chaos. Still, the officer's chest felt tight. He looked down at the radio on his belt, as if hoping it would save him from the situation. But no new messages came through. There was no distraction, no excuse, just the truth he now had to live with. He replayed the last half hour in his mind like a film he wished he could stop. The moment he saw the backpack, the suspicion he let grow too fast, the decision to cuff a man who had done nothing wrong, and the eyes of the crowd, so many eyes that had watched his every move, the regret settled deeper with each memory. He thought about how quickly he had acted, how easily he had let bias shape his decision. For the first time in his career, he felt the weight of being wrong, not in private, but in public, with strangers holding cameras that would tell the story far and wide. The young man began to walk away. His steps were steady, not rushed, not weak. He didn't look like someone who had just been humiliated. He looked like someone who had carried himself with dignity, even in the hardest moment. The officer watched him go, and with each step the man took, the officer's guilt grew heavier. He wanted to call out, to stop him, to say something, anything, but his voice refused to come. All he could do was stand still, while the crowd slowly started to disperse. People were still talking among themselves. Some said they would post the videos online. Others said they would share the story with friends and family. A few looked back at the officer with disappointment, shaking their heads before leaving. Each gesture felt like another stone added to the pile of regret on his shoulders. The street returned to its usual rhythm slowly. Cars moved again, Children's laughter returned in the distance and shopkeepers stepped back inside. But for the officer, nothing felt normal anymore. The world looked the same, yet everything inside him had changed. He finally leaned against his patrol car, running a hand across his face. He wasn't just tired, he was shaken. He thought about what the young man had said. "I told you the truth." Those words replayed over and over in his head, louder than the crowd, louder than the city around him. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a wake-up call. For years he had thought of himself as a protector, someone who kept the streets safe. But what had he really done in those 30 minutes? He hadn't protected anyone. He had humiliated an innocent man. He had created fear where there was none. He had confirmed the doubts people already had about whether officers like him could be trusted. The regret hit harder the longer he stood there. He imagined how the young man must have felt, being stopped for no reason, handcuffed in front of strangers, treated like a criminal while doing nothing wrong. The thought stung like a wound he couldn't cover. And then another thought followed. What if there hadn't been a crowd? What if no one had spoken up, no one had recorded? Would he have let his pride carry the situation even further? The idea made him feel sick inside. The officer lowered his head, his chest heavy with the knowledge that he had let his own bias lead him. 30 minutes had been enough to shake the foundation of how he saw himself. He realized that the badge on his chest didn't excuse mistakes. In fact, it made them heavier, because every wrong move carried more impact when made by someone in uniform. The young man was gone now, disappearing into the distance, but the memory of his calm voice remained. The officer knew that even if the crowd forgot, even if the videos disappeared, he would never forget that moment. The image of the man's steady eyes, the dignity in his silence, the strength in his restraint, all of it burned into his memory. He finally sat inside his car, but he didn't drive off. He rested his hands on the steering wheel, staring ahead blankly. The noise of the city outside was muffled now, replaced by the sound of his own thoughts. He thought about the oath he had taken when he first put on the uniform. He thought about the promises he had made to himself about fairness and justice. And he thought about how far he had strayed from those promises in just half an hour. It was regret, yes, but it was more than that. It was a realization that if he didn't change, if he didn't confront his own flaws, he would continue down the same path, and that, he knew, was something he could no longer accept. The world outside his car moved on, but inside, he sat still, carrying the heavy silence of a man who had seen himself clearly for the first time. The young man's words returned once more in his mind, softer now but still unshakable. "I told you the truth," and in that moment, the officer finally understood. Sometimes the truth doesn't just free the innocent. Sometimes it chains the guilty to their own conscience. The young man walked away slowly, blending into the flow of the street until he disappeared from sight. His steps were steady, but inside, the weight of the last 30 minutes still pressed on him. He knew people had seen the truth. He knew the crowd had stood with him, yet the sting of being treated unfairly lingered deep. He had done nothing wrong, and still he had been handcuffed like a criminal. The officer remained standing near his patrol car, his body heavy with silence. The crowd had mostly dispersed, though a few lingered, whispering to each other, shaking their heads as they left. For the officer, the noise of the city returned, but it sounded different now, distant, almost hollow. He couldn't shake the memory of the man's calm voice, the look in his eyes, the strength in his silence. Later that evening, when the officer returned to the station, the atmosphere was tense. Word of what had happened had already reached others. Some had seen the videos online. Some had heard directly from those who were present. The incident had spread quickly, faster than the officer expected. Colleagues glanced at him, some with questions in their eyes, others with quiet disappointment. He avoided their stares, pretending to focus on paperwork, but inside he was battling thoughts he couldn't ignore. The young man, on the other hand, went home quietly. He placed his bag on the table, sat down, and closed his eyes. The marks on his wrists were faint but visible, a reminder of what he had gone through. He thought about the crowd that had stood with him. Without them, the situation might have gone much worse. The thought gave him a mix of relief and sadness. Relief that people had helped him, sadness that it was even necessary. As the night passed, videos of the incident began to spread across social media. Clips showed the officer cuffing the man, the crowd protesting, the officer's hesitation, and finally the release. People commented, shared, and debated. Some expressed anger, others frustration, and many praised the young man for his calmness in the face of humiliation. By the next morning, the video had been viewed thousands of times. The officer woke up to see his own face on screens. Not as a hero, not as a protector, but as the example of what happens when bias blinds judgment. His regret deepened. He had always thought of himself as someone who wanted to serve fairly, but now he was forced to see the cracks in that image. At work, conversations started happening. Senior officers called meetings to discuss what had taken place. Questions were asked. Why was the man stopped? What evidence was there? How did the situation get so far without reason? The answers were weak and everyone knew it. The officer had no strong defense. He had acted on instinct but not on truth. The young man was invited to speak as well. He wasn't angry in his tone, but his words carried weight. He explained how he had been walking home, how he had been cuffed without cause, how the crowd had to raise their voices for him. He said something that stayed in the minds of many who heard it. I was treated like I was guilty before I was even asked if I was innocent. Those words reached the officer too. They struck him harder than any punishment could. He realized the pain of being judged unfairly wasn't just about one incident. It was about a lifetime of moments that added up. His mistake had not just been about one man, but about what that man represented. Days passed, but the story didn't fade. It became a point of discussion in the community. People talked about fairness, about how quick assumptions can hurt innocent lives. In meetings, some officers admitted they too had sometimes judged too fast. The video had forced everyone to look closer at their own actions. For the officer, it became a turning point. He could not erase what had happened. He could not undo the humiliation the young man had felt, but he could choose what to do next. He had two options: ignore the lesson and continue as before, or face his mistake and change. He chose the second path. One evening, when the sun was low and the sky glowed orange, the officer went to find the young man. It took some time, but eventually he saw him sitting outside a small cafe, quietly sipping tea. The officer walked closer, his steps slow, his heart heavy. The young man looked up, surprised. The air between them was thick with memory. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the officer finally broke the silence. His voice was low but honest. I was wrong. I should have listened. I should have seen you as a person, not as a suspicion. I can't change what happened, but I want you to know I regret it deeply. The young man studied his face. He could see the weight of truth in the officer's eyes. For a long second he said nothing. Then he replied softly, "Regret means something only if it changes how you act tomorrow." Those words settled in the air like stones dropping into water. The officer nodded slowly. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he had to prove through actions that he had learned. Over the weeks that followed, the officer began to change his approach. He listened more, judged less, and reminded himself daily of the mistake he had made. The memory of the young man's calmness stayed with him, guiding him like a quiet teacher. As for the young man, he continued with his life, carrying both the pain of the experience and the pride of how he had handled it. He hadn't let anger control him. He hadn't let humiliation break him. Instead, he had stood with dignity and in doing so, had reminded everyone, including the officer, that truth and calm strength can shine even in the darkest moments. The story of that day remained in people's minds for a long time, not just because of the mistake, but because of what followed, the regret, the reflection, and the chance for change. And for the officer, those 30 minutes became a lifetime lesson. A reminder that power must always be guided by fairness, a reminder that behind every face on the street is a human being with a story, a family, and a right to be treated with respect. In the end, it was not the uniform that taught him the greatest lesson. It was the young man's quiet dignity. It was the truth he had ignored, then later could not escape. It was the realization that sometimes the deepest regret doesn't just come from breaking rules, it comes from breaking trust. And though the world moved on, he never did forget the afternoon when one innocent man, a crowd of strangers, and the wait of 30 minutes changed his life forever.